Well, okay. Welcome back. Welcome back to Kids Club. We had a bit of a break the last time we were together. It was Easter time, so I hope you enjoyed your Easter with your families. But now we're going to keep going with our stories. We're going to keep going with Kids Club, and we're going to keep talking about Jesus and try to figure out who he is. You can remember that Easter was a time when we celebrate that Jesus, even though he went into the tomb, even though he was for sure dead on that Friday afternoon long ago, he didn't stay dead. And early one morning, the women had come to the tomb thinking that they were going to take care of his body, but they got there and the body was gone. And they heard angels and they saw angels wearing bright clothing, and the angels said to them, "He's not here, he's risen." And not only did they hear it from angels, they and the disciples saw with their own eyes that Jesus was alive. Jesus appeared to them, and he appeared to lots of people. And so this news was spreading throughout Jerusalem and their surrounding region, and people were becoming excited. They were happy. They were filled with joy as they began to realize Jesus was alive. Of course, not everybody was happy about this. There were those who were scared about it. There were those who were angry because they didn't want to believe it. They didn't want to think that that was true. They believed that they had defeated Jesus. And now to hear he was alive and that people were celebrating this, they did not like that at all. So we saw that there was different reactions to Jesus rising from the dead. Some filled with joy, some scared and angry. And we also said that we also have to think about our reaction to Jesus rising to the dead. Is it real? Is it true? And again, we said, yeah, that does sound good. It sounds good not just for Jesus because he's alive and he's the hero of the story, but we also heard that, yeah, it's good for us. It's good for us because if Jesus really beat death, if he really came out of the grave alive, then it's also possible for me to beat death and to be alive just as he's alive. So that was last week, and just as a review for last week, and as we like to do a review question, the review question is, well, Jesus rose from the dead. Well, what day was it when he rose from the dead? On what day did Jesus rise from the dead? If you have an answer to that question, be sure to talk to myself or Danielle. Send us a message, and we'll make sure that you get a prize. So Jesus was for sure alive now. He had come out of the tomb, but not only that, he had appeared to some of the women. He appeared to people on the road. He appeared to the disciples. And so now we're going to talk about the next stories, because now that Jesus is alive, well, what happens next? What's going to happen next in our stories about Jesus? Because he's back alive. He beat death. What's next? So today's story is called "The Risen Jesus Appears to His Disciples." So Jesus was now alive, and Jesus, he still had his disciples. He still had his close followers who he had with him through his whole ministry. When he was doing his miracles, when he was healing people, his disciples you remember that his disciples were his team. They were his best friends. They were the people who were working with him. And so in these next few stories, we're going to hear about how Jesus, who is now come alive again, we call him the risen Jesus because he's risen from the dead, the risen Jesus, how he worked with his disciples and how he talked to his disciples and how he gave special instructions to his disciples for the things that were going to happen next. He was preparing them, always preparing them for the next thing. One of the stories we hear is that Jesus had appeared to his disciples in a room in Jerusalem. His disciples were actually quite afraid right now. They were afraid because the rulers of the Jews, the Jewish leaders, they were still angry that this Jesus was supposedly alive. They didn't want to believe it, and so the people who believed this had to kind of go into hiding. And so the disciples felt like they had to hide in a room. And so one time they were gathered in a room, and Jesus had appeared to them, and they had seen him again, and they talked to him, and so they knew again, yes, it's true, he's alive. We've talked to him. Now at that time, we hear that not all the disciples were there. One of the disciples, Thomas, he was not there, and so he didn't see Jesus when Jesus came to visit them that time. Now the following week, they were meeting again in this room, quietly, away from the Jewish leaders. And this time Thomas was with them, and they were saying to him that we've seen the Lord. He came and he visited us. And Thomas, I guess, had not yet seen Jesus. He had not yet seen with his own eyes. And he said to them, to the other disciples, unless I see Jesus and unless I see his scars on his hands, you remember that when he was crucified, nails had gone through his hands. So unless I see the scars on his hand and also the scar on his thigh from when that soldier had pierced him with the spear while he was on the cross, unless I see those things, then I'll actually believe that Jesus is alive. So after Thomas had said this, the disciples were again in this room together. And as they were there and Thomas was with them, suddenly Jesus appeared. And he appeared before all of them. And Thomas would have been amazed looking at Jesus. And Jesus had known what Thomas had said about seeing his hands and his scars. And so Jesus held out his hands and he said, "See, Thomas, see the scars on my hands from the nails. See the scar on my thigh. It's really me." And Thomas was amazed. He said, "My Lord, my God." And so Thomas too was excited. And Jesus replied to him, "It's great that you believe in me because you've seen these things. You believe in me because you've seen my hands and my scars. But blessed are those who have not seen me, but still have believed." Blessed are those who didn't see me in person, but they still believe it because they heard it from others. And so it was that Jesus appeared to his disciples. He had to show them, he had to help them realize that it was really him and that he had really risen from the dead. And even though Thomas doubted it, he didn't think it was real, the Lord Jesus wanted to assure him, he wanted to comfort him and say, it is real. Believe in this. And we might have doubts too about it at times too. We might doubt that Jesus could become alive again. But just remember Thomas. Thomas doubted, but then Jesus showed him the scars and he believed. Now Jesus also appeared to the disciples at other times. Another time, the disciples had gone fishing. Of course, you remember from our stories a long time ago when Jesus first called his followers, called his disciples and said, "Follow me, come and follow me and be part of my team." You remember that a number of them were fishermen. Peter and James and John, they were fishermen. That's what their jobs were. That's what they did. They would go out onto the Sea of Galilee and they would catch fish. And you remember that Jesus had met them while they were fishing. Well, the disciples went back to fishing, we find out. They maybe that's just what they had to do because that was their living, but maybe they were not sure what to do with themselves. Jesus had appeared to them a couple times, so they knew he was alive, but things were different now. And so they were trying to figure it out, and so they went fishing. And they went fishing in the night like they usually did, and they were fishing, and again, and this might sound familiar because we've heard it before, they were fishing all night and they caught nothing. They would pull up their nets, and the nets were empty. And so they were a little ways off the shore in their boat. A few of the disciples, not all of them, but several of them together fishing. And as they were fishing, they saw somebody on the shore a little ways off. They saw someone out there. They didn't recognize who it was, but they saw this man, and the man said to them, "Have you caught anything? How's the fishing doing?" You know, fishermen usually hear that. They usually hear, "Did you catch anything? Are the fish biting?" And of course, it's probably a little bit embarrassing for a fisherman to have to admit, "We haven't caught anything." But that's what the disciples yelled back at this man at the shore. "No, we haven't caught anything. Nothing at all." And so the man called out at them again, "Well, how about you try putting your nets on the other side of the boat? Try that." Well, the disciples, they were fishing all night and nothing else had worked, so why not listen to this guy on the shore? And so they put their nets on the other side of the boat, and sure enough, they felt the tugging, and suddenly their nets were full. Fish had come. They'd filled the net. They had success. There was fish. And they were probably looking at that guy on the shore thinking, who is this guy? How did we all of a sudden catch all this fish? And then it was Peter. It's always Peter who's taking the lead, who realized who the man was at the shoreline. It was Jesus. And he stood at the front of the boat and he said, "It's the Lord. It's the Lord Jesus. It's him." And always the eager one, he actually jumped out of the boat and sort of swam or waded his way up to Jesus, all excited because Jesus was again appearing to them. And this was exciting. And so the rest of the disciples on the boat had to gather up all the fish into the boat, and then they also came to the shore. And when they reached the shore, there, of course, was Jesus waiting for them. And Jesus had actually built a little fire on the shoreline there. He built a fire, and it was morning, so it was probably nice and warm. And as he was sitting around there, he was making some food. He had some bread, and he had some fish. And he said to the disciples, "How about you actually give me some of the fish that you caught, and I'm going to make you breakfast." And so the disciples came onto the shore with their fish, maybe exhausted from a night of fishing, maybe sort of excited, probably definitely amazed that here was Jesus again, and now he's cooking us breakfast. It's kind of neat, isn't it, that Jesus was doing this. The risen Jesus cooking breakfast for his disciples. And so he got some of that fish and he fried it up over the fire, and he took some of the bread that he had with him and handed it out to his disciples, and he fed them. The risen Jesus continuing to take care of his disciples, to comfort them, to give them food, and also, as we'll see, to give them more instructions. Now at this time, after the breakfast was over, the disciples probably went back to their fish and gathering them up and cleaning them up. And Jesus found some time to be alone with Peter. Peter and Jesus were just together on their own. Now, this is important because the last time that we've seen Peter and Jesus sort of in the same story, you might remember that it wasn't too good for Peter, was it? Peter was watching on that Friday night a trial going on, and he was sort of watching at a distance as Jesus was under trial. And you remember that he was questioned by people, he was questioned by a servant girl, about how he knew Jesus or if he knew Jesus. And yeah, Peter had denied him 3 times. 3 times he denied knowing Jesus. Peter probably felt horrible about this. He had denied his best friend. He had turned his back on his best friend. And at the worst possible moment, just before Jesus is going to trial and to his death, and Peter denied even knowing him. And now he was standing on the shorelines of the lake after Jesus had again amazed them with this miraculous catch of fish, and now they're standing together. What would Jesus say to Peter? And again, we see the beauty and the love of Jesus in this moment. Jesus could have been angry with Peter. He could have really questioned him. Why'd you deny me? Why'd you let me go to the cross? But Jesus did none of that. Jesus looked at Peter and he asked him, Peter, do you love me? And of course, Peter would have been sort of amazed by that question, and he would have answered Jesus, and he did answer Jesus, well, of course I do. Of course I do. And so Jesus said, feed my lambs. Feed my lambs. And then Jesus looked at Peter again. And he said, Peter, do you really love me? And Peter might have been thinking, I just answered this question. But of course I do. I do, Lord. I do love you. And Jesus said to him, take care of my sheep. Take care of my sheep. And then again, a third time, Jesus looked at Peter, and Peter looked at Jesus, and Jesus said, do you love me, Peter? And Peter again answered, yes, Lord, I love you. I love you. And Jesus said, feed my sheep. And so it was that Jesus reinstated Peter. He made things okay again with Peter. Just like Peter had denied Jesus 3 times, well, now he had said that he loved Jesus 3 times. If there was any tension between Jesus and Peter, if there was any feelings that Peter had, any feelings of being sad towards Jesus or embarrassed, that was wiped out. Peter had now said, I love you. And in a way, it was Peter being sorry for what he had done to Jesus before. And the beauty of it is that Jesus again says to Peter, follow me. Follow me. Just like he had done even just years ago when he first met Peter, also on the shoreline, also as he was a fisherman. And he said to Peter then, follow me. Now again, Jesus is looking at Peter and saying, follow me. I have a job for you. So in this story, we again learn some answers to this question, who is this Jesus? Who is this Jesus? First of all, we see that Jesus was giving more proof that he was alive. He was making sure that the disciples really knew that he was alive. And if they had any doubts, he erased those doubts and said, no, I am alive, so that they could have it firm in their minds. Yes, Jesus is alive. Because Jesus was preparing his disciples for a mission, for a task. Jesus was going to set his disciples out to work. You remember that he had told them to be fishers of men. Well, now he was going to really do that. He was going to really tell them, go out and be fishers of men. And we'll hear that a little bit more next time about the mission that Jesus had for his disciples. But we can also learn a third thing. We can also learn another thing about these stories. You see, Peter had denied Jesus. He had turned his back on Jesus, and he had made a mistake. And we're like that too, aren't we? We make mistakes. We do wrong things. We say wrong things. We think wrong things. We do that at home. We do that with our parents at school. We do it in the playground. We'll do wrong things and we'll hurt others. Just like Peter hurt Jesus by denying him. And yet we learn something amazing about Jesus. He's not harsh, he's not angry, but he forgives. And so I hope in today's story you learned more about Jesus. I hope that you saw that he is forgiving, and I hope that gives you comfort, and I hope that gives you joy again on this day. And we'll be back next week to talk more about Jesus and the mission that he had for his disciples.